Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. Welcome to today's program, which is titled, Is Sentiment Shifting on Foreign Policy, Alliances, and the U.S.-Korea Relationship? My name is Jonathan Corrado. I'm the Director of Policy here at the Korea Society. This afternoon, we're going to turn to a series of brand new surveys to take the temperature on the general public's feelings towards foreign policy. We hope to learn a few things. Number one, how does the U.S. public view America's place in the world? And Dina is going to handle that one. Number two, how strong are the bonds between the U.S. and its allies like Korea? Dina and Troy will handle that one, and also Uchang. And then three, we'll investigate Korea's public perception of the U.S. as a reliable partner, and Uchang is going to handle that one. And last, all of us working together are going to explore the geopolitical implications for the U.S.-Korea alliance and peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula and then the broader region. I'm very excited to introduce the experts for today's program. They all come packing with unique and insightful contributions to today's discussion. First up, Dina Smeltz is Senior Fellow on Public Opinion and Foreign Policy at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Previously, she was a Director of Research in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research at the U.S. State Department's Office of Research. Thank you so much for joining us, Dina.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
Next up, we've got Troy Stangarone, who's Senior Director and Fellow at the Korea Economic Institute. He previously worked on Capitol Hill for Senator Robert Torricelli on issues related to foreign affairs and trade. Welcome back for the first time in the Korea Society, but you've done Korea Society programs before.
In the old office, yes, but it's good to be in the new office. Or I guess new to me, not necessarily new to you.
Thank you, Troy. Last up, we are delighted to welcome Dr. Chang Kang, Associate Professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations at Korea University. This is a bit of a homecoming for Professor Kang because he received his PhD from New York University in 2015. Welcome, Chang. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Before I turn it over to our panelists, I want to thank the Korea Foundation and our corporate sponsors for making this program possible. We are welcoming your questions live, so please send those in to policy@koreasociety.org, and we're also going to turn to our live in-studio audience here as well. So without further ado, Dina, you are up first.
Okay.
So I hope you can explore the major findings from your recent survey from the Chicago Council. It's a landmark study that a lot of people pay a lot of close attention to. I'll just prime you by mentioning a couple things that popped out for me. A lot of partisanship in terms of policy preferences, big splits there. Nonetheless, a majority of respondents support America's alliances with countries such as Korea and Japan. However, compared to last year, support dropped for sending U.S. troops to defend these allies. So these are all really interesting changes, and I hope you can explain some of these and more for us.
Sure, I'm happy to. Well, it's nice to see you all here today in the audience, and also thanks for those tuning in online. I'm going to kind of breeze through a bunch of the slides because the discussion is always much more rich, and I'd be happy to send anybody the full report if anyone's interested. But the Chicago Council has been doing surveys since 1974. This year we'll be celebrating our 50th year in 2024. This particular survey was fielded September 7th through 18th. So it was before the recent events in the Middle East, which may or may not have impacted some views, but this is sort of a snapshot of views at that point. And what our big storyline is that the United States involvement in the war in Ukraine, our financial assistance and our military assistance to Ukraine has really had an impact on Americans' views on broader foreign policy issues such as alliances, support for military bases abroad, and defending allies. So that's what I'm going to kind of highlight. And as Jonathan mentioned, we are seeing increases in some partisanship, differences between Republicans and Democrats on a lot of these issues, where previously, when we first started polling in 1974, even in the 90s, there was a lot of more bipartisan agreement. So these are kind of new developments that we're watching. Okay, so I hope you can see this okay. The dark black line or navy blue line, is the overall opinion of of all Americans. The red line is Republicans, the blue line is Democrats, and the yellow line are independents. And in our sample, it's pretty much a third, a third, a third in terms of political affiliation. A little more Democrats, but generally pretty even proportions. And independents, people think they're very independently minded, but really they're kind of closet Republicans or Democrats. More than half of them say we're independent, but when you ask them, do they lean toward one party or the other, they will pick Republican or Democrat, and then they tend to vote that way. So their attitudes are oftentimes in the middle, but sometimes they're low because true independents probably are more like a libertarian aspect of things. Okay, so overall, Americans are down on this question. This is our time-tested barometer of support for international engagement in the world. It's not the greatest question because a lot depends on what's in the respondents' minds when they say, do you think it'll be best for the future of the country if we take an active part in world affairs or if we stay out of world affairs? An active part in world affairs could mean many different things to many different people at different times. When we were at 2003, it was about the Iraq War and our boots on the ground. Right now, it's probably more about Ukraine and our focus on that. So it's now overall 57% of Americans say that we should take an active part in world affairs. This has been a steady decline since about 2017, and it's one of the lowest levels ever recorded since 1974. So it's really kind of a big shift. Democrats, you can see they're at 70%, a little bit down from a high of 78, but still really a solid majority. The big drop is that 47% among Republicans. And just if you take a broader look at it, you see Republicans used to be the most supportive of international engagement for the United States, and it dropped around 2015 after the invasion of Crimea. So I'm going to kind of skip through that. I also want to say the difference between Republicans and Democrats on this is the largest it's ever been. Okay, so just to show you, Republicans had been the strongest proponents of an international agreement. As I said, this is the first year in which a majority of Republicans say we should stay out of world affairs. This is really, I think, a reflection of what we're seeing in Congress, especially among certain House Republicans. Also, people are buying into the America First. Maybe we're paying too much attention to what we've measured this in our survey. They think we're paying too much attention to Ukraine and not enough to China. That's the big concern for Republicans. But it's a kind of groundbreaking shift for the Republican public. And some of this decline is probably due to the substantial contributions we've made to Ukraine. So if you look here, there's a big partisan gap between Democrats and Republicans. When Russia first invaded Ukraine, just after that, really large majorities across the board supported our continued economic and military assistance. But it's been almost 2 years now. We've given a lot of money, a lot of military equipment. Republicans are starting to wane on this. Again, a reflection of a lot of the debate on the Hill and among Republican leaders. But it's still pretty high, 50% of Republicans. So they're not abandoning Ukraine, but some people are starting to question maybe how successful our approach has been. And then there's knock-on effects from Ukraine. So especially in attitudes towards Europe and our alliance with Europe. Overall, it's not that different. 64% still say that the United States mostly benefits, or the United States and its allies benefit equally to the alliance. Again, Democrats here, strong endorsers. Republicans are down. And then on the flip side, overall attitudes towards our alliances with Asia, and we didn't necessarily point out particular countries here, but we just said East Asian countries in general, have remained steady overall, but have actually increased for both Democrats and Republicans. This is because, again, Republicans have increased on this because they see China as a critical threat to the United States. Democrats love alliances, love working with other countries, so they're strongly in support. And it's the independents that kind of fell a little bit, which is why the overall opinion is stable, not an increase overall. I also wanted to mention that overall Americans also think that our alliances with Japan, 2/3 or more say that our security relationship with Japan, Korea, and Taiwan strengthen our national security rather than weaken it. So really strong support, and that's bipartisan across the board. And then bases are kind of the tangible way that we can measure support for our allies is through supporting military bases and supporting their willingness to defend our allies when they're under attack or under threat. So there has been a decline in bases really across the board. You can see that it went from 72% in 2022 to 64% for South Korea. For Japan, it went from 67 to 63, and for Australia from 56 to 49 just in the past year. But it's still a steady increase, over time, but it's down. It's dropped across the board, but it's really big drops among Republicans again. So they're in a mood, and I think a lot of it has to do not just with there's a couple factors, right? And we can get into this probably in the discussion, but one is that they don't like Joe Biden and they don't have confidence in his direction. Another is they're worried about the economy and we're spending all this money doing all these things abroad. We really need to focus at home. So those are all some issues. And then in terms of defending allies, as I said, it's like the quintessential measure of support. The support for South Korea is down. But I should tell you, the red is if China initiates a military conflict with Japan. That's the one at the bottom. Americans have always been very wary of a conflict with Japan, but you see that has risen over time as well. The blue line is if Russia invades a NATO ally. That has fluctuated back and forth, and actually Republicans are now more opposed to that than support it, but overall majority. And if North Korea invaded South Korea is our longest trend since 1982. Big jump since 1982, 22% to now 50%, but it's down from recent years. Part of that is because Americans don't sense as much of a threat from North Korea because it hasn't been in the news that much and there hasn't been much written about it. And then again, just showing you it's Republicans that have really fallen. This is one for South Korea. 46% of Republicans now say we should use U.S. forces to assist South Korea if it's invaded by North Korea, down from a high of 68% in 2021. So combination of factors there. There's some, even though we're not in the war in Ukraine, like with our military, Americans are still sensing some kind of war fatigue. We just got out of Afghanistan. And we're now giving all this money and equipment to Ukraine. So I think that has part of some of the drop. But it's down across the board, again, I think because North Korea is not seen as much of a threat these days. And I'm going to pass it on. If people have questions about methodology or anything else, we can address it later.
So I want to jump into a little discussion here. And if you could go back a couple slides to the one about this one right here. So if we look at all these conflicts, right, each and every one of these is an instance in which the U.S. is obliged by a mutual defense treaty to defend our allies. Unlike what's happening in Israel, unlike what's happening in Ukraine, where we don't have those types of treaty alliances with those countries, and yet we are supporting them, right?
Right.
So I'm just a little, so I know that it's what's happening in Ukraine and Israel is definitely affecting people's opinions. But I'm just wondering if the public perception is kind of aware that we do have this nature of relationship which obliges us to defend our partners.
Right. No, it's a good point. No, they're not all aware. Americans aren't that informed about treaties and alliances and the fine print on it. If you look at it by education, it's higher support among better educated Americans or those who really follow the news. It's also, we do surveys of, they're called opinion leader surveys. So it's includes, it's not, you can't do a representative sample exactly of these types of elites, but it's think tankers like us, academics, people in government, especially the executive branch and Congress, business people, journalists, and other people that touch on foreign policy, and it's really high among those people. So some of it has to do with education, but this is just the gut level of the average American. Not all these Americans vote either, the ones that are in our sample.
So we have a partner called the Association of Former Members of Congress, FMC, and we're partners on the Congressional Study Group to Korea. We help bring U.S. members of Congress over to Korea to educate them on the importance of the alliance. And they conducted their own survey based on members and former members. And what they found was that Republican members and former members lead the public in terms of playing a more active role in foreign affairs. So I thought that that was interesting too.
Yeah, they're probably more of the moderate, old guard, traditional Republican. And I think what we're seeing is a shift among the Republican Party toward this more, I'm not going to say isolationist, because they want to still participate in trade and diplomacy, and they still think maintaining U.S. military power is the most important thing for the United States' national security. So they still have those views, but it's more about protecting our own country. So they're taking this very inward approach, the Republicans among the public. So I think that's probably some of that difference.
Interesting. Okay, Troy,
If
yeah.
I could add real quick. I also think there's a threshold issue in the sense of that foreign affairs is a lower threshold issue for the American public. And so some of these issues really only become salient when they reach a certain heightened intensity in the news and everything. So if you think about it, the administration has been largely free to work on foreign policy sort of as they chose, but once you get into war footing or something else, then it starts becoming more salient for the public. So I think that has something to do with it as well in terms of why members often lead the public as opposed to the other way, where you might see it more on domestic issues. And I did have one quick question for you, Dina.
Sure.
On your very first slide, if I can go back, and Jonathan, you're right, it is kind of sticky.
Yeah, the clicker's a little bit sticky, but it'll get you there.
Okay, yeah, so this one. So I really like this because it's a long-term trend, but one of the things that we know is that, one, the people who, because if you look, it looks like it's 1982, where Democrats were relatively unsupportive of American role in the world, but Republicans were fairly supportive. One, that segment of the population, many of them are retired now or maybe not alive anymore. And also that we've seen a shift in partisan identification to where a lot of the people who might have been self-identifying Democrats in the early 80s now are self-identifying Republicans and vice versa. Mm-hmm. So I'm just kind of curious if you have any thoughts on sort of when we say Republicans are less supportive now, what does that kind of mean? I mean, when we're talking about that, given those changes.
Yeah, so we don't have a panel survey. A panel survey is when you interview the same people across every wave, and we just get a random sample every time. So it's hard to say which are which. But I just think that the cues and the messaging that Republican Party leadership is giving today is much different than it was back then. The Republican Party constituency is still a pretty homogenous group, still mostly white. There have been some shifts in education that the better educated now Democrats have a bigger slice of the better educated public versus Republican, and it used to not necessarily be that way. So that also, some of these demographic changes may have shifted some of those views too. But that is especially true for Democrats because there's been major shifts and much more diversity among Democrats, as you can see on the Middle East issue today.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, as you said, I'm going to sort of skip through. If you compare Reagan to Trump, I mean, on foreign policy, they're basically complete opposites. So much different messaging.
Yeah.
So,
All right, Troy, why don't I cue you up?
okay. Oh, sorry. My apologies.
I think you're used to being a moderator.
That's probably fair.
Troy, you had your own survey from KEI, a 2023 report on American attitudes towards the Korean Peninsula. So you found that there's been a growing influence of Korean culture and a growth in Korean soft power. I think all of us have experienced that with the explosion of Hallyu and K-pop. However, your survey finds that less than a majority of Americans think Korea is very influential, and most Americans polled by KEI do not view Korea as a critical partner for the U.S., which is a big blow for us here at the Korea Society and KEI, right? That's what we're working towards. Nonetheless, and this is a little bit paradoxical, 70% of people polled support the alliance, and there was a significant boost in the number who support basing U.S. troops in Korea. So lots to unpack here. Please help me understand what's going on.
No, yeah, I'm going to try to, similar to Dina, just go through a lot of data points really quick and kind of lay some of this out. And actually, I want to, towards the end, talk about South Korean soft power, because this has been something that's come up a lot more recently. So just real quick, here's the demographic breakdown of our sample. Relatively similar to Dina's and everything. 31% Democrat, 26% Republican, 29%, independent. There's the educational and income breakdowns and other things as well. So, as Jonathan said, if you look at this, and this is the last 3 years, we've only been doing our survey with YouGov for 4 years, so not the longevity of data that the Chicago Council and Dina have to work with, but relatively stable, relatively strong support for South Korea. About 15 to 20% over the years who view South Korea very favorable, and then basically 50% more of the public views South Korea favorably. So good views of South Korea, and these views only get better if you start looking at people who are interested in international news, or specifically people who say they follow news in the Asia Pacific region. Now, influence. Oh, and by the way, in terms of partisan breakdown, basically Democrats and Republicans view Korea the same way. So there isn't like a significant shift pushing it one way or the other on that. So in terms of influence, as you can see, South Korea, and we asked this about 17 countries because the way we do this is we start off with some generic questions. We don't want people to know what's about South Korea because we're not trying to prime them. And so here are just the top 10 influential out of the 17 that we ask about. And if you look at this, you can see South Korea is number 9. It's slightly above India. Its influence level has been growing over the last few years, which is perhaps not surprising given the prominence of Korean cultural content in the United States now. But still, not up above 50%. And so if we look, though, at Republicans and Democrats, very few R's and D's see Korea as very influential. They're pretty much relatively close to if we ask this in the fairly influential category. So in essence, Korea is not seen as like a country that is going to be one of the most important partners for us, but it's kind of just in that next rung is what I would say is how the American public is viewing it.
And very much what President Yoon is trying to become, right? A global pivotal state is.
Yeah. Which I guess then aligns with his goals, is that he realizes that Korea isn't seen that way yet either. So there is a little bit of parity there, if you will. I have some other thoughts on that we can talk about later as well. So in terms of critical partner, actually, interestingly here, it's independents who see Korea as most critical for the United States, rather than Republicans or Democrats. And so I thought that was somewhat interesting. Amongst the party affiliations, Democrats are the least likely to see Korea as being critical. Here is the security, the importance of the military alliance between the United States and Korea. You can see it's been relatively stable over the years of our survey. Here, again, Republicans and Democrats basically have the same views on the importance of the alliance.
And people who are interested in international news, much more likely to think it's important.
Which I think this makes sense, because if you look at this in terms of if you're following the region, if you understand what's happening in terms of China's rise, the role of North Korea, you can understand why South Korea is going to be a focal point for U.S. policy in the region. So in terms of challenges to the world, this isn't surprising. China and Russia are viewed by most Americans as the biggest challenges for the United States. North Korea in our survey has consistently been number 3. As you can see, we put this as challenges, so not necessarily to say adversaries or something. We wanted to get it like, what are the problems that America faces rather than simply, these are the countries we like, these are the countries we don't like. And so, North Korea has consistently been number 3. And, I don't think that's going to change anytime soon because Russia and China will be prominent. And even when Kim Jong-un was, testing a lot, last year, it still didn't change much. So I think it's also important to look at why Americans view the region as important. So you can see that most Americans do, and Dina kind of talked about this, I think it was in terms of the military alliance focus on Asia, you could see a change there. So Americans are viewing this region as more important. I don't have this in here, but there is a slide or a question we ask in terms of how do you actually view what we should be focusing on the region? And the interesting thing in the data is that it's actually shifted. It's not the security side. It's now much more economic and trade focused. And I think that's because we're seeing a lot more discussion today about the importance of supply chains, how China could be a threat to our supply chains and national security. And those are not discretely military issues. They're much more economic issues. And so you're starting to think I see that flow more into the public consciousness about what may matter to East Asia isn't necessarily the military side, but is actually the economic side.
Before the pandemic, no one had heard the term supply chain. Now, afterwards, we're all experts on semiconductor sources.
Outside of people who actually ran businesses or a few policy people, yes, no one had heard of the term supply chain probably. So this is just on military alliances in general, because we kind of wanted to be able to put this in context of how Americans were seeing the role of alliances and whether they were important. And so it's not surprising there are differences between Republicans and Democrats on this. For the most part, you have about 20% of Republicans who want to keep alliances as they are, 29% that want to largely keep them but reform them, and then you have 23% who want to end some alliances and reform others. If you look at this from the Democratic perspective, 28% want to keep them as they are, 26% would like to reform them, but only 14% would like to take and basically end at least some of our alliances and reform others. Now, what's actually, I think, the most interesting thing here is because there's been a lot of talk about whether alliances matter to the United States and whether we should keep them. There is zero support amongst Republicans and Democrats for ending all of our alliances. So I think there's a lot of questions Americans have in terms of, are these the right alliances? Are they structured properly? But I don't think that there is actually a push in the United States against the idea of alliances. And so we may see some political rhetoric that may suggest that, but the actual public doesn't view the world that way.
Interesting.
So this is where I want to talk a little bit about soft power. So one of the things we ask each year, and this list changes because different movies and different dramas come out, is essentially, are you watching these products? You can see Squid Game, around a fifth of Americans have watched Squid Game. A lot of things, it tends to be much lower. And if you look at this, most Americans said we haven't watched any of these, or listened to their music. So, Blackpink and BTS may be up there, but still you have a lot of Americans who haven't engaged with this content. So are you fans, though, of Korean content? Once again, most Americans are not. What is interesting about this data is this is very much a generational thing. If we take and we look at this, basically from the 40s onward, no one in America is a fan. I mean, you're talking like 5% of Americans in those age brackets up are fans. You get to the 30s, it's between, depending on the type of content, about 11 to 14% of Americans. You go down to people who are 18 to 24, which is the lowest age group that we survey, and you see essentially basically 16 to almost 20%, depending on the content, are fans. I'm guessing if we could actually do people from like 12 to 17, you probably see much higher content. And so I think this is important when we think about Korea's influence and we think about Korean soft power, because in essence, a lot of Americans, we should be clear, Squid Game is a massive hit, but the fact that it's a massive hit that BTS has, I think, 6 #1 singles, still doesn't mean that necessarily the majority of Americans are engaging in this content. The majority of Americans are being, influenced by this content. And so when we think about soft power, part of that is about the idea that you are more amenable to a country's views or policies because you have engaged in their culture and their content, and you're more naturally inclined to be favorable towards them. And so I think if we think about Korean soft power, I don't think it's changed much right now. I think it's also a lagging indicator. And this is something that, has the people who are in their 20s and teens start becoming older and start moving into policy, I think South Korea will have much more soft power then than it probably does right now, because they'll be naturally more inclined to South Korea.
Yep.
And so keeping that in mind when we talk about soft power and these types of concepts. And the one other thing I would say real quickly on this is that we also live in a much different media market than, just to give a very obvious example, when the Beatles broke out, when there were very few radio stations, very few TV stations, to where now everything is splintered. And so it's going to be hard, I think, for South Korea to really push its soft power as well, just because of that divided nature of media. And so this just kind of tells you real quick sort of whether, if you were amenable to Korean pop music or something else, whether you were interested in other parts of Korean culture. And so you can see, for example, pop music, you tend to be interested in Korean culture in general, the Korean language, things like foreign policy and affairs. This isn't necessarily surprising, you tend to be less interested in. So I have two real quick slides that look at, and these are from our first survey in 2020, and at some point I should probably redo this. But the question we kind of want to know is, do you actually realize Korean companies are Korean? And so we asked about different companies, because once again, I didn't want people to know we were asking about Korea specifically and everything. And if you look at this, Hyundai and Kia, they're not quite 50% of Americans, but 44% know that Hyundai is Korean. 47%, at least as of 2020, knew that Kia was Korean. But if you go to what I think would be the companies you would most expect, like Samsung, 26% of Americans know that Samsung is Korean. And if I remember from the data correctly, I think actually more thought it was Japanese. So you have this challenge, LG only 23%, to where part of Korea's soft power is actually, I think, inhibited in that most Americans don't realize that the product that they're using that is Korean is actually Korean.
Yeah. Really interesting. Okay, so let's stop and pause and think a little bit about what we just learned. Woo-Chung or Dina, any questions or comments that popped up for Troy?
Yeah, I'd like to, first of all, ask, do you have any sense if Americans are becoming more just aware of South Korea? I know when I first joined the Chicago Council, I had worked on Middle Eastern and European attitudes towards U.S. policy, and I was really concerned that Americans wouldn't know the difference between North Korea and South Korea in their views, but they definitely do seem now to know the difference. But I just wondered if you have tracked any increasing awareness just of
Not a specific question on that, though. I think that might be a good one to try, because I want to try and do this sort of soft power range of questions to try and add in maybe in the future to try and see. I need to think about the right way to phrase this. Obviously, once again, you don't want to prime people, but you kind of see, are you more aware of South Korea as a country, as a part of the United States or something?
Yeah.
You need to think about the right way, but that'd be an interesting question to look at, yeah.
Yeah, maybe we can do something together on that.
Oh, yeah. Well, and the other thing, too, I sometimes think about this is if you think about awareness, and if you look at sort of on what I had in terms of the countries the Americans see as critical and everything, part of this, I think, is that we're primed by our own media. Think about it. Justin Trudeau is in the press all the time. Canada's right on the border. It's understandable. We might talk more about Canada than we do Korea because it's a border country. But, if you think about Macron is in the news a lot. Verish tend to go through prime ministers a lot now, but whoever it is tends to be on the news a lot. But Yoon Suk-yeol doesn't make the press very often in the United States. So if you're an American, even just in your watching your daily news, you're not hearing much about South Korea.
I think you're right. I think there's just a built-in positive feeling about Korea with not necessarily because the last 5 surveys we've done and we've put, or every time the Korean president changes, it's always a majority favorable, but it's almost exactly the same number. Yeah. So I don't think they differentiate between leader to president to president, but they have a good feeling about Korea. Yeah. So there's room to grow.
When we first started about this, one of the ideas that was tossed out was, should we ask if Moon Jae-in was the president at the time? Americans very real with Moon Jae-in, and I was like, I don't know that Americans will know who Moon Jae-in is beyond maybe 5 or 10%. So I think there's challenges there too. Yeah.
Right.
And that's why the American Pie moment at this latest state visit was so important, because it cut through the formality of a state visit, which is highly ceremonial and structured and formal, and presented President Yoon as a person singing American Pie. What song are Americans going to like more than that, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I think in New York it might be My Way, but I just want to toss it out.
Nah, I'd go with the Boss. I'm a Jersey guy,
Okay.
so I got to go Springsteen. Um,
I also have a
yeah,
question
please.
about Troy's presentation. So you have some data about exposure to Korean soft power.
Mm.
Do you analyze any relationship between those exposure make their opinion, correlated to their opinion about the Korean soft power, evaluation of the Korean soft power, or other stance, like what was that? Something like like alliances, importance of alliances with South Korea.
So I haven't done this, but the way YouGov sets it up, we can cross-tabulate to sort of see
Right.
how those who are amenable. This is actually a project I've wanted to do. I just haven't had time to do, so it's
Yeah, it's
coming.
going to be a very interesting
But
question.
yeah,
Yeah.
because I actually think that's important too. Is sort of like, are those who are more amenable and interested in Korean
Right.
culture actually also much more amenable to Korea? Because if there's not, that would also if there's no difference between those individuals and the average American,
Right.
then that would suggest that actually Korea's soft power isn't very influential, even with those who are amenable to Korea.
Yeah, just the influential, evaluation about the soft power of South Korea itself. Also, I wonder if their attitude to the alliances as well.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah,
So
no,
we did
no.
a whole program called Korean Smart Power
Mm-hmm.
with John Delory, Jenna Gibson, who was previously
Yes.
at KEI,
And Jenna has seen some of this data, and I gave her access to some of the back end stuff too.
Bernie Cho, who's a K-pop producer,
Right.
and Victoria Kim at LA Times. And we were asking, New York Times. We were asking, how do you convert this soft power into hard power?
Okay.
And it turns out to be really tricky. There are
Is
so
it?
many challenges to
Okay.
trying to. How can Korea mobilize this to help its geopolitical aims?
Right.
Well, it turns out that so much that is working for South Korea in the soft power realm is, well, there's a lot of government support for these things, but it's difficult to manipulate because once you turn it for use towards propagandized aims, it loses that K cool.
Yeah.
Well, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, that just makes sense.
And I was just going to say, I think the challenge is everybody always talks about how do you take and make this into a foreign policy tool. I don't think there is a way you directly do it. It's like America's never gone to someone and said, you like, the boss or something, so therefore do X. It's just there's an innate way Americans are viewed, and so because of that, it makes people more likely to, want to agree with our policies.
Right.
And so I think part of this is about, how South Korea is viewed. And if that improves the general relationship, that then makes other countries more amenable to South Korean views on policy.
So we can take heart.
So it's indirect, but it's not direct.
Right. And we could take heart that the young generation are the ones that are particularly fond of K-pop because that suggests that we've got a durable trend going on here. And I'll just end on this note that I looked at a survey of North Koreans consuming South Korean media and their favorite things that they watch, including anything, their own domestic content, Chinese content, was Squid Game and Parasite, which if you think about those movies very carefully, they're critiques of capitalism, right?
Right.
So that must have been so interesting for a North Korean who's so accustomed to seeing propaganda films in which the system of the country which they're in is praised and reinforced, to see a media product coming from a capitalist society criticizing that society, right?
Yeah.
What an indicator of what freedom actually means. Okay, Woo-Chang, I want to turn to you. You've done a lot of awesome research looking at things from the Korean point of view. So hopefully you can explore some of these trends and then we can get your thoughts about some of the survey findings that Troy and Dina were talking about.
Sure. So the first presenter is focused on American perspectives on South Korean and international relations. So I'm going to talk about South Korean's perspective about the U.S. and alliances. And unfortunately, this is not my own survey, unlike the other two presenters. This is the collection of the existing surveys I got from the news media and others. So, and my interpretation of these data. Okay, so first thing I want to share is the overall evaluation. There are several indicators about understanding overall evaluation of the neighboring countries. I choose this question because it goes back to as longest as much as possible. And what you can tell, I mean, out of this number, I want to tell is that the first thing is that the positive evaluation about the United States has continued to grow compared to 2007. So if we look at these like more recent data, like 2015 or something, it seems like South Koreans seem to have a pretty stable opinion about the U.S. But when we think of the 2002, I mean, even before the 2007, one of the most popular terminology to describe the South Korean public is the anti-Americanism. There was a time that because of the U.S. military force accident, I mean, some of the high school girls were killed because U.S. military. The anti-Americanism was very popular at the time.
Yeah.
But now you can see that it's all changed. Stable opinion exists about among South Korean publics. They have maintained about the United States. And another thing is that you can see, I want to focus on is you can see that there are some changes in China. It's much smaller number compared to the United States, but there was a time, early 2010, there are some favorable opinion about the China, but it changes since 2015. So now you can see that only like less than 5% choose China as a country that they feel closest. And in terms of these changes, I want to focus on. So you can see that between 2015 and 2020, in general, those who favor China decreases over time from 50 to 20%. I mean, the questionnaire is a little different from the previous slide. And you can see also similar changes in 2015 and 2020. There's also a decrease in terms of number of people who say they favor the United States as well. So when you look at these changes by age group, you can also, another important change is that the pro-US opinion, and which is correlated with the anti-Chinese China opinion, is more strongly appear among younger generations. So back in 2020, I mean, early 2000, it was the younger generation or the so-called 386 generation who expressed most strong dislike against the United States.
Sure.
But it totally changes now. Younger generations maintain more favorable attitude toward United States. So out of these three slides, what I want to focus on is that, so in terms of changes between 2015 and 2020 regarding China, so one of the important factors that affect, in my understanding, to South Korean attitude toward China was the THAAD deployment issues in 2017, and another issue was the 2020. So if you go back to the slide, you can see the decrease in these 2 years, 2017 and 2020. Those who feel close to China decreased a little bit. And on the other hand, in terms of changes in 2020, I think it related to the special measure agreement regarding the dividend between the payment for the U.S. military in South Korea. Like, if you remember, the President Trump initiated that negotiation, and it kind of gives a kind of bad impression to South Korean public about the value of, I mean, how to interpret the U.S. alliances. Is it about money, or is it real? They're really
just to refresh people's memory, he asked for $5 billion.
Yes.
Instead of the $1 billion that Korea was currently paying per year to support U.S. troops in Korea. So it was a 5 times increase that he asked for.
So I think the way he approaches the issue, I mean, it's not just about the money itself, but about the way that President Trump approached that issue was really not that attractive to South Korean perspective. So they thought, I mean, in general, we thought it's a kind of value, it's about security. We had an impression that we had a shared interest exist between the US and South Korea, but Trump approached it as a matter of economic issues. And I think it's kind of a bad impression to South Korean public, which related to the slight decline in the 2020, which I showed in the first slide. And in terms of your impression about 2023. So this is not anymore the cross temporal issues. It's about the survey done this year. So in general, about 73%. So in general, like I think 70% of the public has a very favorable opinion about the U.S. and the U.S. Like U.S. alliances. And when you divide why, the good reasons, the most important out of this data is about 50% says economic opportunities, but at the same time, democracy matters, and international responsibility that U.S. Has is the reason why South Korean public has a favorable impression about the U.S. At the same time, those who have a bad impression pointed out like a 55% point out the unfair practices. They are concerned about the U.S., how U.S. dealing with other countries' trade and economic relations. And also there are concerns, 56% point out the American exceptionalism. So, those who have a bad impression are worried about U.S. kind of take advantage of their leadership or strong power for the benefits of their own country. So that's why, those who have a bad impression that point out this as a main reason. And in terms of, in terms of ROC-US alliances, so South Koreans are worried about, aware of the possibility that they can be intervening into the conflict in Asia that are not related to the national interest, but at the same time they have a positive evaluation about the importance of ROC-US alliances, in particular to guarantee safe from the pressure by the US, China. And in terms of various issues about ROC-US alliances, what you can see, 90% of the people are okay with, positively evaluate that South Korea play a role to joint response to address the global challenges like the climate change and infectious disease. And most concerned issue is the possibility that the South Korea becoming involved in the military conflict in the Taiwan Strait. It's 44%. But for your interest, if you're interested in this, is a much higher number compared to Japan.
Wow.
In Japan, they're much less inclined to involve in this kind of event if there is something going on between.
That's very much opposite of what the public perception is about.
Yeah, exactly. Japanese does not want to intervene into this event. It's still a low number, but we'll see. Yeah. So, okay. Yeah. So on the last slide is that, South Korea tried to view, at least at this survey, they think that it should be more than just dealing with ROC-US alliance. It should be more than just dealing with North Korean military threats. So they are okay with developing this further, reserving the regional global issues. So summing up, I think the sentiment shifting. I don't know what the sentiment was referring to, but if we focus on there is a generally positive evaluation about the ROC-US alliances. I think it's pretty stable, and in terms of security and democracy, the interest of South Korea's economic security and democracy, South Koreans are aware of it's very important, and especially younger generations are pro-US and anti-Chinese, maintain this pro-attitude, US and anti-Chinese attitude. But at the same time, there are concerns about maybe can we maintain the belief about the shared security and economic interest out of this? And then if we involved in kind of more than just North Korea, can we be sure that they are consistent with our national interests, something like that? Yeah.
Excellent. If you could just quickly go back to that slide about should the alliance evolve. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
One more forward about whether the U.S.-Korea alliance should evolve, and most South Koreans supported that fact.
Which one?
It was, I think, the next to last one you had.
Next to last one.
Yeah, the one just before the summary slide.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah.
So just to prime some ideas for, okay, so what does that mean? What does it mean for the U.S.-ROC alliance to evolve? And there's been some really interesting work, and I'll throw it out to the panelists for your thoughts. But I'll mention two. Clint Work just came out with a good article, Clint also at KEI, about beefing up UN command and what that might mean. And Germany has considered whether it should join UN Command, and Japan also plays a big role there. And then evolving beyond just countering North Korea, there's been some discussion of, is Indo-PACOM and this command structure best suited to deal with the array of different contingencies that can arise in Northeast Asia, and some discussion of whether there should be a Northeast Asia command, and then Korea would be a natural place to headquarter Northeast Asia Command. So just a couple of different, but naturally that would be viewed very provocatively as a provocative action by China. So is Korea ready to take on that kind of role, as that's what it means to be a global pivotal state, right? To be able to play a little bit more of a bigger role, but also weather a little bit more frustration from regional competitors.
So one of the things I think that's interesting about this is I remember a conversation with an individual who became a senior member of the Park Geun-hye administration. I was in Seoul about a couple weeks before the election in 2012. And you may recall that Lee Myung-bak had his global Korea policy. Korea is playing a much bigger role regionally and on the world stage. And I asked, it's like, listen, I've worked in politics. I understand you have to change the names of things to make it yours. It's all fine. But are you going to, in essence, keep that policy, or not? And their response was, we feel the Lee Myung-bak administration has taken the focus off North Korea, and we need to return to focus on North Korea. And that's essentially what they did in Northeast Asia. And so I think the fact that the public now is kind of saying, actually, we need to look kind of beyond North Korea, I think is important. And hopefully that means that even if the next administration calls it something else and does things slightly differently, there'll still be elements of what Yoon is trying to do with the global pivotal state going forward, and that we won't kind of go back to just North Korea only.
Right. And even Park Geun-hye had NAPSI, right?
Yeah.
Northeast Asia Peace and Cooperation Initiative, right? So still had that regional outlook, although maybe not the same kind of focus on it.
Yeah, I think this graph shows that maybe it does not mean that Korean public naturally inclined to do something more than just dealing with North Korea. So here, so far the ROK-US alliance has been discussed, at least in practice, in dealing with the North Korea, and never expand dealing with more than that. So maybe it indicates that, situation might be different when these issues are actually developed into something like more specific policy oriented, right? People might have different ideas, but when it actually happens. But right now, it's at the symbolic level. They think about, maybe it's because, as pointed out, this is done by this year after President Yoon makes a lot of statement about we need to do more than just more in global and society. Democratic summit and stuff like that. So that may affect this positive evaluation about doing more than just dealing with North Korea. But
absolutely, and might also refer to all the other different types of cooperation that the U.S. and Korea have going on, critical supply chains, technologies, that sort of thing.
If you look at our joint statements with South Korea since the Biden administration began, so both under Moon and Yoon, they're significantly different than any of the ones that had come before. They're much more focused on these broader global issues.
They're very long and very detailed.
Yeah.
Okay, I have a bunch of questions, but I want to get to our audience questions, so please raise your hand. I see Sean King has a question, so we will get a microphone to you. Sean, can I guess what you're going to ask about? No. All right, well, I'm going to do it anyway. I think that Sean is going to ask about 2024 big election year. What does that mean? No. Wrong. Okay, we got a mic for you.
Well, he can't ask that question now because you've set him up to ask it. So.
Okay.
And of course, when we're talking about big 2024 elections, we're talking about the Taiwan elections on January 13th.
Certainly, that's the first.
Of course,
many.
yes.
Yes.
But based on this 74% slide, which is also what got me thinking, let's say in an ideal world tomorrow, North Korea collapses and Korea unites under Seoul government. Can we interpret this to say that there would be appetite among the Korean population for U.S. troops to stay in Korea as a hedge against China and other uncertainties going forward? So just like there are still troops in Germany today, 30 years after the Cold War, do we think there's an appetite in Korea for U.S. troops to stay there, even if Korea is peacefully united under the Southern system? Thank you.
Okay, I think that's very hypothetical situation. But in my response, so in terms of trilateral alliances between South Korea, China, I mean the U.S. and Japan. So among the people, I mean, of course, the opinions are divided. But when we focus on the people who have evaluate this trilateral alliance positively, the greater concerns on China, right? Not the North Korea. I mean, over time. I mean, in the past, so South Korean think North Korea is a main threat. I mean, major threat. Most of the people, but more and more, the number of people who feel China become a security threat increases over time. So even if, I mean, that's very hypothetical. I don't think it will happen in the near future that the North Korean government collapse. But even if that happens, as long as China maintains the current status, current relationship between the U.S. and South Korea, and as long as South Korean public perceives China as the main security threat, I think that people will, those people will agree that U.S. stay in the Korean Peninsula, yeah, as a way to prevent the Chinese threat, yeah.
And another question there is, would China tolerate a whole, free, united Korea that is run by Seoul?
Right.
And if they didn't tolerate that, what would the conflict look like? And then afterwards, what would that mean for Korea's posture?
So that's why I thought it's very hypothetical. I don't think China would tolerate the united Korea in this format. So yeah.
It's a good question. I want to get to one of our virtual audience questions, but please raise your hand if you have anything else. Nahid Furdis asks, how has the U.S. reaction or lack thereof to Ukraine, Russia, and Palestine, Israel, those conflicts, how does that impact Korea's point of view of America's reliability?
So honestly, after I read that question, I look up again. I don't have my own survey, but I couldn't find any public opinion surveys like asking recent events. I mean, effect of recent events on their attitude toward the United States. But when I don't know. I mean, so yeah, there's no official data. But when I look at some of the responsive to the news articles, in general, some of the conservative people are on the U.S. side, I think. But other than that, I haven't seen any sources that address this question yet. Yeah.
I haven't found anything specifically asking that question, but there was something close that I thought might be interesting, which is the Korea Times and the Yomiuri Shimbun do an annual poll, and it came out in June, and it found that 65% of Koreans think it's important to work with the U.S., and that and specifically to contain Russia, and that number, and they also 76% think it's important in general to work with the United States, but that is up 10% since last year. So kind of look at those two data points. I mean, I don't want to get into correlation being causation, but it could suggest that there is a greater sense of the need to work with the United States because of what's going on in at least the Ukraine conflict.
Right. And clearly a Korean Peninsula aspect to the conflict in Ukraine, given that North Korea has been supporting the Russians with artillery, anti-tank munitions, etc., and South Korea, through some clever accounting, has been able to support the U.S. ability to supply artillery to Ukraine.
I think this is something that maybe actually most Americans don't realize, is that the Korean Peninsula has become a focal point in the war in Ukraine for the reasons you said, but also North Korea has been publicly very supportive of Russia, so they're trying to provide political support. South Korea, while it hasn't necessarily advertised this, one, last winter helped Ukraine get a lot of the power stations back up online. Two, they've been taking it, in the first year of the war, they were reducing the consumption of Russian oil and LNG. And when I was looking at the trade data the other day, this year actually South Korea has imported zero crude oil from Russia. So, like I said, it's very quiet, but they're kind of doing what they can not only to take and sort of support the war indirectly via armaments, but also support the sanctions as well.
Yeah. Okay. Do we have another in-house question? Yeah. We'll get a microphone to you.
Thank you for a very interesting conversation. I have three-part question. The first is, difference between Haley and Trump, does that make any difference in the sample in the question? Second is, what would be the impact of U.S. introducing some weapons into the peninsula, which are non-conventional, beyond what it has right now? Would that affect how Koreans view things and Americans view things? And last but not least, when you look at the Korean-American community, what is its impact on the relationship both in the U.S. and in Korea towards each other? Thank you.
Okay, a lot to unpack there. So let's take it piece by piece. So first, any difference in Koreans' understanding of America as a reliable partner if Trump wins in 2024 or if Nikki Haley wins in 2024? She's currently polling number 2 for the Republican spot. I don't think we have information on that
Nikki
granular
Haley
level.
is not well aware of among the South Koreans yet. But if Trump wins, not Biden, I mean, they think it will be different. I mean, so I don't know. I mean, so when Trump had a bit like a meeting with Kim Jong-un, I mean, it was South Koreans are very optimistic perspectives about, like, we felt as if the unification comes right after that summit, something like that. And then everything has changed all of a sudden. So that was a time that Trump has a very good impression. And then 2020, as I pointed out, I mean, so I mean, I think I don't know. It's at this moment, I think that if Trump wins, South Koreans feel less stable. I mean, less comfortable. I mean, because of they cannot make an expectation what's going to happen next time, right? Uncertainty. I mean, feel less uncertain what's going to happen if Trump wins. So if Biden continue to wins, maybe we have certain expectations. I mean, stable. I mean, if he makes some move, but it wouldn't be that different from the past. So continuity exists. But if Trump wins, given that we don't expect what's happening in the future, maybe that's one source of uncertainty, uncomfortableness, I think. Yeah.
The second part of the question is an interesting one too. So if the United States mobilizes some strategic assets to Korea, we're talking about nuclear assets, right? How will that impact Koreans' perception of America as a partner? And, Chicago Council, Dina's colleague, Carl Friedhoff, has done research on this question, and in particular about South Korea's interest in developing indigenous nuclear weapons, which is support for that is quite high, around 65%. And I think that leads South Korean interest in the U.S. positioning tactical nuclear weapons. We took them out in '92, so to put them back in. But we do rotational deployments of strategic assets, bombers and submarines too. So any feeling about would Korea feel very good if America were to deploy nuclear assets back to Korea? Yeah.
Me? So, okay. So again, so it's about, as I said, it's about uncertainty. I mean, so as in terms of the proportion of people who support developing our own nuclear weapon varies with the surveys and what's happening in the recent event. So sometimes the majority of people still do not want to have nuclear weapon in the peninsula as it or not support developing our own nuclear weapon. But in other surveys, at least there are some politicians who actively claim that we have to develop our own nuclear weapon. But one of the reasons why these arguments brought up is, as I said, the uncertainty, whether the U.S. will continue to provide the nuclear umbrella as they did in the past, right? So, as I said, I think Trump changes a lot of things. I mean, based after the Trump dealing with the North Korea and there several statements he made spoken. Sometimes, I mean, we talk about the fake news this morning, but kind of lose like a South Korean face that about that U.S. continue to provide the nuclear umbrella, continue to protect South Korea from North Korea is weakening, or at least as sturdy as in the past. And that's related to the argument about we need to develop our own nuclear weapon. So as long as I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's not actual deployment. I mean, it matters, but it gives the confidence, whether it's actual deployment or a symbolic any kind of statement. As long as the South Korean, as in my reading, has a faith that there will be a continued support for maintaining the nuclear protection, it doesn't matter whether we develop our nuclear weapon or not.
That was one of the really interesting things of the Chicago Council survey was that the majority of people who supported South Korea getting its own nuclear weapons also had faith in the United States, the credibility of their nuclear commitment to defend South Korea. So that's like really a puzzle, right? But I think we're starting to have a more perception about North Korea's ability to impose some dilemmas on the United States. If it can successfully mate an ICBM with a miniaturized warhead and then even develop MIRVs and all kinds of other capabilities thanks to Russian support, and hold the U.S. hostage, is America going to trade Seoul for Los Angeles, right? Like, that's a dilemma, right? And North Korea is increasing its ability to impose that kind of dilemma on the United States. So that will naturally drive insecurity in Korea. Troy, any other thoughts here?
Well, I mean, I guess one, I've never really liked the analogy of trading Seoul for Los Angeles, just because one, I don't think North Korea would ever use a nuclear weapon against Seoul. It would be, mind-numbingly foolish on their part, unless the regime was absolutely collapsing. And two, I think the challenge in all this is, I think, and not being it's lost, is that, we have, 28,000 troops in South Korea. If there is going to be a war, they're likely going to be the first target. It's hard to imagine a U.S. president with tens of thousands of American deaths simply saying, we're going to withdraw. So I understand that we face deeper strategic challenges now, but I mean, I think that this is kind of like an overblown, sometimes, dilemma.
But you could pose it in a way where it was more of an incremental kind of creeping sort of attack with less U.S. casualties, in which case the U.S. public would have some questions about, okay, the declaratory policy of the alliance is that if North Korea uses nukes at all, the regime will cease to exist. Okay, let's say they nuke a military installation, there's minimal casualties. Now we are on the hook to destroy the Kim Jong-un regime, or else face a really loss of credibility for our alliance partner. And we know what the cost of that war is going to be. It's going to be horrible for Korea and for the United States and for the people of North Korea.
True, but I mean, this works the other way too, which is that if we don't defend South Korea, then all of our other alliances wither away because we have no credibility. So we're kind of, so either, this ultimately comes down to, and this is something only the president at the time will decide, either the U.S. will have credibility or it will not have credibility. The one other thing I would say, is when we look at this issue, we think about if Trump were to win, this whole question of strategic assets may change because these are very expensive to deploy. Trump wasn't a fan of deploying them under his own administration, and if he was, he wanted South Korea to pay significantly more to do it. So we may actually see a lessening of the deployment of strategic assets if Trump were to be president.
And a favor of South Korea developing its own nuclear weapons, right? Because that would mean America pulls out. Fine, Korea, defend yourself. That attitude could prevail. Do we have one final question from our audience before we close it out? Yeah, okay, we'll get a microphone to you. There's a switch in the middle there, if you could push the toggle up.
Thank you. There we go. All right, I'm rocking the house. Okay. You mentioned military forces and whether we would make that decision or maybe not back the South Koreans. I would argue that our militaries are so intertwined on the peninsula that it's a non-decision. If South Korea is hit, we move with them. The major force we have, the major component is the 2nd Infantry Division. Since 2015, the 2nd Infantry Division has been a combined ROC U.S. division with ROC elements attached directly to and under American command. Right. So that was done specifically. It helped us in terms of strengthening division without putting bodies there. But on the other hand, I think there was a lot of other thought that went behind that too. And along those lines, I mean, I don't know if you call that soft power per se, but it's not hard, maybe medium power, in that, you're bringing together the militaries of the nation and creating a culture. I mean, there's decades of American soldiers and airmen who have cycled through Korea since the war.
Yeah.
And even veteran organizations now, I mean, since the Korean War veterans have mainly left us, there are now veterans of the DMZ organizations that continue. And so that bond is real. Now, that's within a military community. It's not society writ large. But I think it's a pretty strong one, in my opinion. I don't know how that affects the overall scheme.
Yeah, I like to think so, and I hope that you're right. And another one of those organizations is our close partner, KDVA, Korea Defense Veterans Association. We work together with them a lot, now headed by General Scaparati and Colonel Steve Lee. But ultimately, it comes down to the decision by one person, the commander-in-chief, right? And who's that commander-in-chief going to be, and what kind of mood is he going to be in on that given day when that happens? If you remember what happened in Hanoi, right, it was also the impeachment proceedings on the same day as what was going on in Hanoi. So what kind of mood will there be when it comes time to make the decision? But Troy or Chung, do you have any other thoughts about this? This is a good question.
Well, I mean, I guess one thing I'd say is it's, in essence, it's networked power because we're now networked together. And I mean, this is a great point about how our militaries work together. I think I would be more concerned about the slow erosion of the alliance because of, let's set Trump aside for the moment because I know we talk about him, but that if U.S. politicians start looking less favorably upon alliances in general, and there are now a lot of members of Congress who take that view, and they start over time pushing policies that lessen our footprint in South Korea or that take and remove some of these bonds that you've talked about, then I think we could get into a situation to where maybe if there's a future conflict, this would be an issue. I think it's less so now, and I think it's because of not just those ties, but if you think about the United States, there's like over 100,000 Americans or more in South Korea, the majority of whom are in Seoul, at least on the non-military side. All of those Americans would be trapped in a conflict. We'd have to find a way to evacuate them. And having talked to former people at USFK, there's no good way to evacuate, Americans from a population the size of Seoul and everything. So I think in some ways we are kind of in this, and we are committed because there are American interests at stake, there are American lives at stake, and I think all of those things do matter. Now, maybe you have a president who doesn't believe those things matter, but I'd like to think we don't get to a point where that's the case.
Woo-Chung, any thoughts on this one?
Well, I mean, I think it's important, as I said, having a belief that the U.S. and South Korea has a shared interest, shared values. I mean, when I said interest, it's not just meaning about economic interest. I mean, that we share the same values about democracy and freedom is really important. And there are many good reasons that we had a stable belief. I mean, we had like South Korea and U.S. has developing such a belief so far, and I hope it wouldn't change because of a certain short-term event like who wins an election, which party becomes.
Saying that you can't withdraw troops without giving explicit reasons, and I would hope that going forward that would remain in. But yeah, I mean,
and that's from what I've talked to the folks at CFC. That would be relatively easy for the Secretary of Defense to certify that pulling troops out wouldn't have a negative impact on the U.S. security posture. Right? It's an easy thing to go around, but it nonetheless voices the Congress's
it's a political
concern.
Cost, though, for any administration that wants to do it, because then they have to justify on some level why.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming in on this very chilly December afternoon. I've learned a ton. I hope you have too. Could you please help me give a round of applause to our wonderful panelists? Stick around.